Good afternoon. For those who all are already with us, we still have a few minutes before all people get in. So let's wait for everyone to join us. It takes a bit of time for everyone to connect. So. So good afternoon, everyone. We're going to wait for a minute. Give time. I see that some people are still connecting. There's kind of a latency in the connection, so we'll wait maybe just one more minute before we start the presentation. Okay, it looks like everyone is connected. So welcome, everyone. My name is Louis Beaumier. I'm the Executive Director of the Institut de l'Énergie Trottier at Polytechnique Montreal. Thank you for joining us this afternoon for the presentation of the IET's proposal for Canada's 2030 emissions reduction plan. The next hour, the webinar will last for 1 hour. First 30 minutes will be a presentation given by Normand Mousseau and Simon Langlois-Bertrand, the co-author of that report. And the other 30 minutes will be for question and answers. I invite you to type your question and answers in the Q&A window of the application. You can type them during the presentation. We'll try to address them all, or as many as possible, in the last 30 minutes. But I apologize already if we cannot answer them all. Before giving the floor to Normand and the presentation, I would like to just present briefly the Institut de l'Énergie Trottier. It's been created with a generous donation from the Trottier Family Foundation. It is located at Polytechnique Montreal, but even though we're in a engineering school, we do not limit ourselves to talking about technical or technological topics. And this is what brings us today. It falls under our mission, in fact, to we have some sort of an obligation to make a proposal for that plan. And the proposal you will see today is based on some of the rigorous work we did in the past year or so. So with that being said, I will give the floor to Normand and Simon for the presentation. Ah, on t'entend pas, Normand.
Thank you. Good afternoon to all. Good morning to those in the western part of Canada. So I'm Normand Mousseau. I'm a scientific director of the Institut de l'Énergie Trottier, and I'm professor of physics at Université de Montreal. So before we start, I would like just to justify why we are publishing this report today, this plan. Essentially, many of you know, the Parliament in Canada has adopted at the end of June last year the Canadian Net Zero Emissions Accountability Act, which requires the Ministry, the Environment and Climate Change, to publish a plan essentially on how it will reach the target. And the 2030 emission reduction plan, which will detail all the actions to 2030, must be submitted by the minister by the end of March 2022, so within a month or so. So in order to support this plan, to support the reflection surrounding this plan, the Institut de l'Énergie Trottier decided to prepare its own analysis of what must be done on a sector-by-sector basis, for targeting both the 2026 and the 2030 horizons, which are coming quite soon. The first thing we need to know is that this builds on a lot of work we've done in the past. So the report that you will see today is fairly short, but it builds on a lot of data, a lot of analysis from the Canadian Energy Outlook, the second edition we published last fall, as well as the 2030 milestone that analyzed the challenges to reach 2030's target, and other various work we've done on buildings and etc. So this outlook in Canada was looking at a number of scenarios, and we are building on what we saw needed to be done to reach net zero by 2050 or 2045, 2060, but also comparing this with what the situation was, and also what happens if you only put a tax, for example. So by comparing these transformations, we can better understand how each sector can react, at which speeds, what technologies are available. And we build this in this proposal we're having today. So let's start with a bit of context before I give the floor to Simon, who will be describing the plan itself. So essentially, we have to realize that in spite of the fall in emissions in 2020, which will be reflected in the next inventory, there's been a rebound, and essentially everything that was lost in some way in 2020 has been regained. So we have not yet today started to reduce emissions in Canada. We are likely at the same level or slightly above as we were before the pandemic. That's one first things we have to note. Second thing, the main actors in Canada are not moving at the right speed to reach 2030's target. And when we're talking about the main actors, we're talking about the provinces. So provinces are not acting whether on land use, whether on vehicles, whether on buildings or subsidies to use of fossil fuels. Nothing has changed significantly, and none of the actions, none of the plans taken in the provinces are aligned with the targets for 2030. It's the same thing if you look at utilities, for example. Utilities, when you look at the plans, the investment plans and all this, no utility in Canada is planning the upgrade of the network, the decarbonization of electricity, and the production increase that is required within 8 years to reach these goals. Finally, you can go much broader. You look at industry, manufacturing. All sectors in Canada are essentially behind what needs to be done in order to reach the targets. And this is clearly seen when we look at the evolution, the trends in emissions. If we look at the Canadian GHG inventory between 2014 and 2019, and we just expand the trend to 2030, you see that most sectors have been growing within 5 years between 2014 and 2019, and it's likely, because the trend has not turned around, to continue. And some sectors are very surprising. Buildings, which we thought would decrease, have been increasing over the last year due to the increase in natural gas in this sector. Transportation has never managed to reduce its growth other sectors that have been growing, energy production, oil and gas has been increasing. So very few sectors are in line with the reduction we need to get to 2030. And this trend that we have to revert is increasing the challenge that we're facing today. So just a few guiding principles that are behind what we're proposing. So first, what we are proposing, all measures and policies that we are proposing are compatible with net zero at 2050. It doesn't make sense today to go into dead ends and to choose technologies that we have to revert within 5 years or 10 years to go to net zero in 2050. That means, for example, that expanding natural gas is a dead end. Subsidizing energy efficiency by more efficient gas furnace in buildings is a dead end. These furnaces will be there for decades and are not compatible with net zero. We have to realize also that there's a balance and everything must add up. So if we offer lesser reduction or plan lesser reductions in some sectors, clearly other sectors will have to double down on their efforts and their reductions to compensate to get to the targets. So clearly we cannot give too much to one sector without understanding that all the other sectors will have to compensate. And that forces us to take both a global view and a sectorial view to be able to move forward. So effectiveness is contingent on measuring progress and adjusting the measures that we are facing in each sectors to get to the targets. So with this, I will stop and will leave the floor to Simon Langlois-Bertrand, who is the main author of this report.
Thank you, Normand. Thank you, Louis. Thank you all for being here. So the plan we're presenting and that we're publishing tries to outline what we see as the critical steps to be taken towards 2030. And that takes into account two things which are essential in our view. One is the fact that 2030 is 7 and something years away now, so less than 8 years, and the fact that a lot of it has to do or must aim to set up motion across sectors, which we haven't really seen historically in Canada, even recently, as Normand showed with different figures earlier on. It should be noted as well that the plan does not include behavioral effects. There are different reasons for that, but the main one being that at the moment and for the rapidity of the changes that we're suggesting and that we think are necessary, we don't see this as having a major impact, at least in the short term. It doesn't mean it's not important, but that's one reason why it's not in the plan here. Another thing is that you may see energy efficiency showing up only in some small parts of the plan. We think there are important parts, but we also think that betting everything on energy efficiency is a mistake, especially in the situation we're in right now. And therefore, there are many measures that we think should be prioritized, even though energy efficiency, again, is really important in some applications and sectors in particular. So as was said in the previous few minutes, our analysis here is based on both the extensive modeling we did with ESMA for the Canadian Energy Outlook and for various analysis that we did for different sectors. So I'll try to cover them sector by sector. Of course, I don't have time to cover every single thing that we said in the plan, so you're welcome to look into the document online that is now available, I believe, or should be shortly, and let us know if you have any comments, of course, in the question period. So all scenarios leading to either net zero on the longer term, large GHG reductions on the shorter term, and or both, in our work and in many other modeling work in Canada and elsewhere in the world, they all include a broad electrification of all sectors to get there. It's not the only solution, but it's one of the key ones. So the implication, of course, is that electricity networks have to be adapted to provide this demand, and this demand will simultaneously be much larger, but it will also come from new drivers which present new profiles. So the decarbonization of electricity production is certainly an important goal, but it has to occur alongside this broader transformation of electricity networks and their role in or throughout society. What we saw in a review of investment plans that are published by utilities and planning agencies across the country is that most of these actors are not readying their grid for low carbon electricity production to meet the 2030 targets, let alone later very rapid increases in demand that we see projected for after 2030. And therefore, that is really an important issue to begin with, and that should be taken care of throughout this plan. So the measures we propose is to find a role for the federal government to fund infrastructure upgrades for transmission and for distribution as well. So we have new drivers that are expected because of the electrification of buildings, of transport, of industry, and so on. And we have new profiles for this demand as well, which can be planned for and which we more or less know what will look like. Another measure would be to maximize the mostly untapped potential of interprovincial electricity trade, which is relatively small historically in Canada for various reasons, but jurisdiction being one, to temper some of the technical challenges that are linked to the management of variable production from solar and wind in particular, and peak demand as well as different sectors electrify and perhaps exacerbate some of these challenges. So there's a lot of results here that could be achieved, but what we think are absolutely necessary is to have very clear investment plans to make these upgrades to the grids across the country by 2026, to have shovels in the ground as quickly as possible, and have at least some of that upgrade done by 2030 in order to meet the 2030 target. Again, as a reminder, this is only the first part, so this discussion is about 2030, but of course, there's part of this plan that must be about what comes after December 31st, 2030. And part of this is the fact that the trends that will be set into motion for changes in electricity demand over the next several years will accelerate after 2030. And therefore, the upgrades must be planned for carefully, even for what comes after. We also suggest a 75% overall reduction of GHG emissions from the production of electricity based on 2019 levels to occur before 2030. And of course, that's in part due to the different drivers I mentioned earlier. If I go to the building sector, the challenge of building, decarbonizing buildings is very much different. It's largely a scale issue. The number of buildings is quite simply enormous. And one thing we must keep in mind, however, is that technological uncertainty is relatively small here, since most modeling work shows that the energy mix for the sector will be overwhelmingly electric. So the measures go through different regulations and much tighter building codes that impose more stringent criteria in terms of energy efficiency, but also measures that ensure that the transformations made move rapidly away from fossil fuels and especially natural gas. So we propose that this source be eliminated for all new buildings very rapidly, and also for applications where it would require or result in an expansion of current gas distribution infrastructure for existing buildings. Then a calendar could be established for its phase out for the buildings already using it, as many provinces did in the past for heating oil, for instance. Another measure would be to impose peak demand management, winter peak demand management for upgraded buildings. So as the buildings electrify, it needs to be done with care and with much better management of demand in order to deal with the needs for peak demand during the winter when it's coldest outside, especially for space heating, obviously, which is the main target here. In terms of the results, I forgot number 4, sorry. Look into what the role could be for district heating, which we don't really know at the moment. Maybe small, maybe significant, but it'd be interesting to have better data on this to see if anything can be done on that end. In terms of the results, so by 2026, have building codes that are rapidly updated for efficiency and for net zero energy consumption requirements. They have no new buildings using fossil fuels from 2024. to have reductions from the sector evolve rapidly towards 45% by 2030, and to have national roadmaps developed to fully decarbonize buildings by 2040, which again goes back to the point of not only having measures for achieving 2030 targets, but also planning for what comes after. Now for industry, and I'll talk about oil and gas production separately in just a bit, but so this is industry outside of oil and gas. It's always important to pay attention to the question of, on the one hand, processes, so those which emit non-energy related GHGs, and the production of heat on the other hand, which varies significantly in terms of the needs depending on the industry. So one-size-fits-all measures in industry are difficult to apply. So there's hosts of measures that could be done, and those we suggest, for instance, to use the performance-based pricing system in place, but to tighten it and to deal with exemptions very rapidly. So that could be done with existing policy in place. So that's a strong advantage instead of starting from scratch. But also assess the potential for waste heat recovery, which is quite important in terms of lost heat in high heat applications. So that could be used elsewhere. All of this, the idea here is to lead to the adoption of a zero emission heat code for low and medium heat applications by 2026, to have no new fossil fuel industrial use in low medium heat by from 2030, sorry. And importantly, throughout the next few years, develop clearly targeted roadmaps for the specific issue of industrial processes. And this can be done by 2026. It includes the last measure you see on the right as well to determine the potential use of CCS for industrial processes where low carbon solutions or other low carbon solutions are not applicable or very difficult to use. So when CCS is unavoidable, in other words. So we think that this could lead to a 40% reduction in emissions by 2030 for heat applications or heat production, and perhaps 30% for industrial processes. Now for the transport sector, so the transport sector cannot be decarbonized quickly due to a host of factors. One is the slow turnover of different fleets, a lack of appropriate technologies for some specific subsectors, heavy road transport, for instance, or freight in general. Also the challenge of ensuring supply as the sector decarbonizes. So if it electrifies rapidly, for instance, then that creates pressure elsewhere to supply this electricity. So this is true as an observation of the sector for personal vehicles, but it's important to keep in mind it's even more true for all other subsectors in transport. So short-term measures have to recognize the limits of GHG reduction potential in this sector for the 2026 horizon at least, and even for the 2030 target. But at the same time, it has to significantly improve the conditions for a later transformation to occur, and ideally much more rapidly than what is projected at the moment. So some of the measures here finance and incentivize the rapid installations of additional EV charging infrastructure, especially in locations that are outside of homes and where vehicles are likely to stay idle on stable schedules. So workplaces, for instance. The idea here would be to better understand how EVs can contribute to storing capacity of the grid over the medium term. Another measure would be to regulate the expansion of natural gas distribution networks for heavy or medium commercial transport, which is an attractive way of reducing GHGs for these subsectors where electrification or other technologies may take more time to really play a large role. But at the same time, this must be done with care so that we don't end up with stranded infrastructure for natural gas. So this is true of other sectors as well, but perhaps it's important to remind ourselves that this is an issue here as well. Also, a revision of the clean fuel standard for at least two reasons: protect the agri-food sector from price hikes due to a higher demand of biofuels, for instance, or other use of biomass, and also to ensure that biomass remains available for the essential negative emission technologies that we'll need in the longer term. So on that point, I'll say more on a slide on biomass in just a bit. So in terms of the results here, well, in general, if emissions from the sector have plateaued in 2026, it will already be a major success, given the trends that Normand presented in the introduction. But also we need to have a plan for heavy transport rapidly and to have built the first of these infrastructures before 2030. It takes time to take effect. Again, the transformation of the sector takes a lot of time here, perhaps even more than in other sectors, and therefore it's important to get started as early as possible. Are there results to be achieved? Have infrastructure in place to accommodate new electric vehicles by 2026 across the entire country, so filling in the gaps, some regional gaps where it's more difficult to have access to these infrastructure. Have zero emission vehicle mandates for all vehicles in place by 2026 to ban first generation biofuels as well. So again, this is all in the interest of setting the sector into motion towards deeper reduction, perhaps more importantly for after 2030, but a lot of movement must be initiated as soon as possible in order to do that. Now, I'm sorry, oil and gas production. If oil and gas resources are to have a long-term economic future, the existing operations have to decarbonize and move the focus to the production of net zero emission products rather than simply focus on reducing the emission intensity of production. Of course, I don't have to remind anyone of the prime importance of emissions from the sector in Canada's GHG profile, but it should be stated here as well that in our own work, we see that very large reductions in its emissions are both the easiest and cheapest way from an energy system perspective to reduce emissions countrywide, especially for the 2030 target. So there are also the measures or the reductions that would require the most attention to carefully manage the economic disruption in populations that are directly impacted by the change. So in terms of the measures proposed, well, we have one measure that was proposed by the federal government, or announced, I should say, in the fall. So a hard cap on emissions from the sector, which is currently under study, at the House of Commons. So the implementation of this hard cap through a cap and trade system mechanism specific to the oil and gas sector should be done very, very rapidly. Also, another measure, as I stated just a minute ago, make sure to provide support to offset any negative economic impacts from this very abrupt transformation, which will touch, of course, specific communities and workers. So that's an essential part of what needs to be planned for here. So this could lead to very sizable reductions. And so we outline here 30% by 2026 and 60% by 2030. And just on the second measure, even if it's less than 60% by 2030, it will still be a rapid transformation. And therefore, measure number 2 is certainly important to keep in mind. Now, so a few more things, especially on biomass, the importance of biomass in providing the opportunity for negative emissions production. So this is through the use of biomass with carbon capture and storage for electricity production, for instance. This is essential to reaching net zero on the longer term. So better knowledge and management of this resource across the country is crucial. So we propose to rapidly design and implement a national plan, including guiding principles for managing the allocation and use of biomass, especially because biomass is not just used for energy purposes or GHG reduction purposes. The land is used for agriculture, the biomass is used for construction materials. We have biofuels of different forms versus electricity or even hydrogen production with biomass and CCS. So there's a long list of usage that will compete, and we have to be careful about the quantity available and how this can be better managed. So this also goes through increased support for research on this issue to better know what we're dealing with and what the potential truly is. We mentioned here as well, beyond this plan, to try to really see and assess and put in place actually different facilities that would test the biomass with CCS negative emissions activities for electricity production, for instance, by 2030, and really enable us to know what can be done more precisely with that particular type of activities towards net zero. So just before concluding, in this plan and in other work we did, we we identify governance gaps that we think are essential to close if the measures are to be effective, these measures or other measures. And one important thing is to improve data publication on GHGs. So to have much more up-to-date information. At the moment, national inventories for GHGs are published with a 2-year delay. In some provinces, it's even longer. So this needs to be very rapidly changed to a 6-month delay at the most in order to be able to follow the impact of measures. Alongside this, there needs to be a mechanism in place to independently assess the progress and the impact of measures in place every year, and to adjust rapidly, again, with a horizon of less than 8 years, if we are to adjust given different things that work better perhaps than we thought or work less well than we thought. Adjustments need to be made very rapidly, and that goes through the capacity to make that assessment rapidly. We also suggest the creation of a federal agency to improve expertise and support the reduction efforts and the adaptation efforts across all departments, and ideally across all levels of government as well. All information that would be very useful to this transformation. So in terms of the conclusion, we really see the main goal of this plan to be sending a very clear signal to all stakeholders that Canada is serious about achieving these targets. And this is difficult and needs to be done on a very short time scale. So this is not happening today, as Norma outlined earlier, in any major sector. And at the same time, we have to recognize that the federal government cannot move alone here. So all other stakeholders must get on board, and the plan is certainly one tool in ensuring that this happens. So we've never really managed to reduce our emissions, in spite of a lot of expenditures and a lot of efforts. And so realistically, we think it's more than likely that all the reductions that are outlined here will not occur by 2030. So our estimate globally is that with a lot of efforts at all levels, we could reach 25% by 2030, 25% reduction. So really the idea here is at least changing the trend and start to engage seriously on the path to net zero, instead of constantly discussing much more aggressive targets. Thanks.
Thanks. Thank you, Simon and Normand. There's already a number of questions in the Q&A. You still have the time to add some more. I would like to start with one question that talks about the fact that the report only suggests 25 to 35% reductions in emission, and it is perceived as pessimistic. Can you say a bit more about why the IET didn't explore pathways to achieve the 40 to 45% or even more ambitious pathways?
So first, we've done the modeling for 40-45%. If you look at the outlook, you will find these modeling. However, our experience on the ground, so we have talked to a lot of people in industries in various sectors. We are working with them on a day-to-day basis. And what we see is that there's absolutely no preparation, no planning on the ground to do the depth of transition that needs to be done to reach 40-45%. So that's the hard reality. It's not something we wish, it's something we are observing and we realize every day. So we need to change this, and this will take time. If we just talk about utilities have no plans for expenditure for upgrading network to get to what we need to be in 8 years. So the first thing is to make sure we change this topic, we get everybody in line, and we start moving, and then we can discuss targets. But at the moment, it's absolutely not, I don't see any way we can get to 40-45%, given the structure, given provinces are not acting at the moment. So the federal will have to do a lot of pushing on that. And so that is creating issues. So it's not what we want, it's what we evaluate can be done with significant efforts.
Yeah, I would say that we would be more than happy to be wrong, right?
In the right, but if we're wrong, it will likely be in the wrong direction. So that's
But I can add to that as well. You were mentioning, Normand, the energy outlook we did, but in the scenarios where we model to force the 40-45% reduction by 2030, we see how it could happen And it's based on this and the information we get on the ground that we see a very, very significant gap. So we can look at what can be done, but at the same time, again, less than 8 years away, realistically, there's a lot that needs to be built in order for that to happen, and we're not seeing it now.
Thank you, Simon. Two questions, or two related questions on first generation biofuels. Could you define what they are and what's the rationale of banning them?
So the first generations are those that were used with ethanol and corn, so corn-based, grain-based, so and the others. So those are essentially fairly high emissions up front. So these biofuels contain a lot of emissions for their production and their transformation. So they are not compatible with net zero. And in fact, they don't reduce that much. They have also major impact on the food sector. And we see this today with prices going up. So these first generation should absolutely be banned. We also, I would like to come back to the biomass that Simon was telling. In a net zero world, the role of biomass changes deeply. So we cannot use biomass to kind of scatter around in biofuels to heat buildings, to serve in the transportation. We need negative emissions to balance the emissions that will remain in the economy. And the best way that is seen today is through carbon capture of biomass being burned, essentially. So to produce heat or to produce electricity. And this can only be done in a very industrial setting. You cannot have this in cars in every home in the country. So the role of biomass is strongly, strongly limited by the fact that we require carbon neutrality, so net zero. Is hydrogen part of the solution for high emission emitters industries? Simon, you want to have a... Or
sure. We don't know. That's the true answer at the moment. It's certainly an avenue that needs exploring for high emission industries, and especially for applications where there's a lot more uncertainty in terms of the technologies that may be used on a medium-term basis to decarbonize. So again, this is the plan for 2030, and I insisted in my presentation, I think, on the need throughout the plan to plan for the next plan, or to plan what comes after 2030. So hydrogen must be part of this planning, but in order to play a significant role in achieving at least short-term measures, we don't really see how that would be possible. It doesn't mean it's not important to look into it for later emissions as well, of course. And on the hydrogen, there was another question about why should we stop expanding the gas network, because we could put hydrogen in the net. The hydrogen will not be sufficient to replace all natural gas in Canada. We'll have to use it for specific uses. Because there are issues also with hydrogen. And therefore, in large parts, we should stop expanding the network of gas, and we will have to electrify buildings. It's much more efficient than using electricity in most places in Canada. Not everywhere. There are places where there's a lot of blue hydrogen that could help, at least in the short to medium term, with limited infrastructure investment. But in most places, it's not compatible with the transformation we need to see.
How much will the electricity grid have to expand to transition to electricity services from fossil fuel energy services?
So by 2050, we evaluate it has to double the capacity, 2.2, so 220% increase. So that's a lot of increase. And as we electrify buildings, transportations, industry, manufacturing, then clearly electricity grid has not only the distribution grid also, not only the production. So both have to go forward. And in some way, we cannot wait for the demand to appear to start planning the production and the upgrade of the grid. Otherwise, we'll be too late and we'll be stopping this capacity of transforming.
And by how much of what would be the impact on the energy prices if we want to pay for that plan?
On the energy crisis, you said?
Prices.
Prices.
Yeah, that's an important question. One of the issues here is, of course, to make sure that energy prices reflect really what we're trying to do. And Of course, carbon pricing is part of the answer to that, and it does play a role, but prices are not enough to initiate the type of infrastructure direction changes that we think are necessary. And I think that's an important distinction. There needs to be direction set by actors and authority, as well as reactions by actors, which are basically consumers, right? So some actors are much more responsive to energy price changes. So that's part of the solution, or at least part of what will drive changes. But that doesn't eliminate the need to set directions for deep transformations that are necessary to achieve any of these targets.
Yeah, and if I might say, what we see today when we look at utilities, for example, is that the fear of seeing the rates increase is really limiting the capacity to plan transformation. So the proper way to do it, and when you look abroad in other countries who are moving ahead, is first you say that's the goal. We have to achieve that much electricity production or that much electricity transformation, insertion in various sectors. And then you start from there, and then you go below and say, how do I decrease the cost for the user as I move there? Not saying we cannot move because costs will increase. We also have to realize that it's the service that matters, it's not the rate. If I use a heat pump, for example, for my electricity, I can be competitive with natural gas. So it's not only kilowatt hour per joule that you have to compare, it's the final service. And that is, I would say, largely missing in the way we analyze the issue in Canada.
In other words, the question was really about should all the transformation be paid by the energy services, right? And what you're saying is that in fact, we do not have to foot the bill to consumers directly to their energy bill.
There are many ways to do it, but the point is that first you need to decide, are we going there? We are going there, and then work out the best solutions after that to ensure that the right people or the people who can pay.
One question here about carbon leakage that could occur through implementation of any of the proposed measures. Have they been considered in the modeling?
Yeah, they're considered in the modeling. At the same time, we take as a starting point the fact that Canada is operating in the Paris Agreement environment, where what matters is emissions on a territorial basis. So of course, we're not denying or trying to neglect the impact on carbon leakage, but if Canada moves as part of a more global movement on these issues, then first it needs to figure out what to do with its own emissions on its territory. So there's a limit to how this can be included, and of course, it's important to keep that in mind as well. So not neglect them. On the shorter term, we think that's not the main issue here. So first, initiating the transformations would be a significant step in moving the right direction, and then we can talk about that as well.
Thank you. About the hard cap on oil and gas that is suggested in the report, what level of cap is your modeling suggesting? So, and what is the implicit associated production curtailment?
The cap is on GHG emission, not on production. Okay, so the idea is that what we see is to reach 40% reduction by 2030. It's at least 60 to 65% reduction in GHG emissions. So that's the modeling. What we propose is that we should remain aligned on that. So around 60% reduction by 2030. This can be done by carbon capture and sequestration, or reduction of emissions, or other technologies that we don't see at the moment. So the idea is that if prices are very high, you can imagine that the industry could invest in CCS and manage that. Otherwise, it's likely that we'll have to reduce their emissions. Again, because scope 3 are not the matter here. What is exported to other countries is for the other countries to manage. So in that sense, even if you keep production, if you limit emissions in Canada, you meet Paris Accord, and that's for the buying country to manage the other side.
So more question on the use of biomass. They seem to some are thinking that what you're suggesting is to cut forest and burn trees to produce electricity. Can you say a bit more about where that biomass is coming from, and that you're not suggesting that cutting every trees?
Well, if we cut every tree, and there's there's no more trees, then that will work for year one, and that's pretty much it. So we're certainly not considering that. That being said, it is true that there's a significant amount that we talk about improved management. The underlying text here is improved management in the sense that we make sure that it's renewed as quickly as possible and that the land is taken care of carefully, so that the renewable aspect of biomass is really utilized to its maximum potential. But there is a need for a very large quantity of biomass in order to get to net zero in our own analysis. So if we want to use less of that because we want to use biomass for other reasons, or we just want to leave it there, then that creates additional pressure on how to reach net zero. We're not saying it's impossible, of course, or that it's an avenue that should not be explored, but we have to, from that starting point, that to reach 2050 net zero, it's already very difficult, and it already requires the use of all possible biomass.
Let me add, though, that the amount of biomass we're using is something which is an official number. So we sat down with NRCan, we sat down with the government official, and we said, okay, what's the decent level that you are suggesting? That's what we put in the model. So we tested, if you look in the outlook, we tested scenarios where more biomass is available, less biomass is available. And we underlined the fact that there's a lot of unknown about this, and a lot of issues about, as Simon was saying, multiple roles. So we're not just allowing to burn the whole country down just to get biomass.
That's reassuring. Thank you. Do you see a major role for a new nuclear energy system, such as small modular reactors?
I would say nuclear, in our modeling, doesn't appear because it's not cost competitive with wind plus storage. But there's nothing that prevents. This is really, it goes beyond the level of modeling we're doing to do a more, I would say, strategic analysis of what's needed. Clearly, nuclear energy is low carbon. So on that side, it meets the requirements. And then after that, it's a question of how do we balance the electric grid? What are the costs of the alternative technologies? And can you deliver in terms of resiliency, which is also an issue that needs to be treated, and that it's not in our model. So that's how I would answer this question.
Simon, you want to add something?
That's pretty good.
So a highly technical question here. How much of the international credit framework under Article 6 is included in this plan?
Zero.
Okay.
We don't include, it's all, we're really using the internal emissions. So we don't buy anything from outside.
Okay, a question here on freight or long distance transport. How about working with the US to, oops, sorry, I lost my question here. Excuse me. Cursor this one. Okay. How about working with the US to move long distance transport of cargo from trucks to rail and keep at the last 50 to 100 kilometers for trucks?
Rails are already extremely used, and the main issue is just in time. And really what we see is that given the distances, given the speed at which rail is moving in Canada, the fact that it's very used, it's not easy. So it's not in our model because we don't model transport at that level of details in terms of capacity to say, can we switch and how much can be switched? It's issues that people have been looking at, but it's also, we are avoiding all type of deep transformations that can take years and years to develop. If we're looking at the horizon, we're looking, trying to reconstruct the economy, trying to reconstruct all the way goods are assigned and all this, it's a challenge that people have been talking about for years without making significant advances. So we try to focus on places where we think it's possible to achieve transformation on the timescale we're talking about.
A question here on the building retrofits to remove all the fossil fuel from buildings. Can you comment on the state of readiness in Canada, supply chain availability, installers, financing, etc., for heat pumps installation to be able to scale up?
We don't have that level of data in the modeling exercise for sure, but it is an issue. As I mentioned, the issue for buildings, especially for the short term, is scale. So there is technically a host of different levels of reductions that we could achieve by 2030. and the cost would not necessarily be enormous, but indeed the manpower and the supply chain issues may come into play as we expect more deep changes. But yeah, there is a limit to the data we have on this for sure.
And for industrial heat pumps, that's where we need to move manufacturing as well as large building. We don't have much capacity in Canada, but it's clearly something that would gain to be developed. And we're proposing in our plan to work on that, because that's a way to develop some industrial bases in Canada, some service industries that could support this transformation. And so we think it's very important. There's more work to be done to understand how that can be achieved, which industries can support this. But clearly, as we move forward, as we're facing also slightly different issues than others due to climate, for example, we would have strong benefit in exploring this and building an industrial support for that in Canada.
Thank you. Any suggestion about how biogenic emissions should be treated compared to fossil emission from a policy point of view? So.
Essentially, biogenic are outside. I mean, we're typically in the scope that the climate, the IPCC and the Paris Agreement is all emissions linked to human activities that are accounted for and that fall under the Paris Plan. In our model, we are modeling human activities, emissions from human activities. And outside of this, it requires a specific expertise that we don't have. So we cannot treat that at the moment. So we don't have, I would say, a position.
Thank you, Norma. Another question. It seemed you were not entirely convinced of the gains through EVs because you need electricity elsewhere. Can you comment on the emissions reduction from not burning gasoline versus emissions from burning natural gas for space heating? Is it the right trade-off?
There's a few things to say here. One issue is that I don't think we downplay the importance of EVs for reducing emissions. We think it's one of the reasons why electricity demand will change and increase drastically in the next decades and even before 2030. However, in the context of this plan, a lot of the attention needs to be focused on 2030, and we don't see that having necessarily a major impact, at least not as major an impact as it will have or is likely to have if we reach targets like the zero emission vehicle mandate for 2035 or the target to have no gasoline powered vehicles sold by 2035. So when you look at the 2030 or the measures to achieve these reductions by 2030 for transport, it's a bit limited. But as I tried to be very careful in my presentation, you have to remember that this is not to forget the importance of the transport sector and of what seems to be the main path, which is electrification, at least for individual vehicles. But in terms of the impact on the countrywide GHG reduction target, it will remain limited, even if things move in the right direction at a very rapid pace, or more rapid than what we've seen.
Thank you. Question here on pilot projects for geothermal electricity in Saskatchewan using same workers and equipment that are used in oil and gas. Why is geothermal electricity not used more?
Essentially, it doesn't come out in our modeling because it's expensive, much more expensive than the alternatives. So this is in our modeling. I mean, there's nothing that prevents on the ground from happening because there are other reasons. The model we're running is really a model of lowest optimal expenditure based only on cost. So there are other issues. We were talking about nuclear before, geothermal, all these are possibilities. And it's not a question of this cannot happen. So it's there. And I saw a few questions about modeling. This report that we are presenting today is not a modeling exercise, it's an analytical exercise. We build this on the model and all the data is available for this model with annexes. It's the energy outlook that was published in last October. So for people who want to have the background for this work that we're presenting today, I would say there's two main reports to look at. Maybe Simon, you can put them up the screen. we have this energy outlook that we produced, and it's also, we had an analysis of I would say, comparison between ECCC and our own modeling by 2030, which is on the way to net zero, the 2030 milestone. So these two contain a lot of the data that is needed to understand why we structured this report today. And we kept it very short today because we didn't want people to get lost, and we wanted to highlight the important challenges.
Yeah, and if I may add to that, there were many questions asking where could, if there were more data available and where they could get them. I posted the link to the webpage from where you can download the energy outlook report, but also all of the data, the numerical data that are presented in the report.
Yeah, I removed the sharing of the screen, but the PowerPoint will also be available on the website shortly. So you'll have access to that as well.
Yep. So since we have a few minutes left, would you gentlemen like to make a final concluding comment or remark?
There was a question about that is left, I see, on the on the furnace and tools. I guess it's part of what we're writing. That's one of the proposals, is we need to have a plan for this. It's to support either the production, but also the installation. So this is something we are proposing. We need these plans. We need these schedules. In industry, we need to design norms. We need to design regulation. We need to design something that will, frameworks that will facilitate this transformation and that will let the industry take the move. At the moment, everything is structured so that the risk of moving is much larger than not moving. And what is needed with this plan that the federal will produce in a month is to shift this risk by either saying this is where you have to be, bite in it and get there, and then we can work out the details, or as saying we're putting regulation, we're putting subsidies, whatever it is, but we need to shift to get the country into motion. And if you compare to the UK, you compare to Sweden, you compare to other countries, we are totally failing this move, this from the base on of trying to get into the action. That's why we are not more optimistic and we're not projecting 40–45% reduction. We don't see how that can happen over this 8 years.
Okay, just one final question that just came in about
why not
limiting sales of new private vehicles, right, after 2023.
I mean, that's excellent.
With limiting like selling vehicles with a cap on consumption.
Clearly, those are all possibilities that should be looked at. The challenge is that it's not so easy. It's not transforming very rapidly, the transport sector. But we have avoided really analyzing in our model these kind of behavioral changes that can be imposed from outside or taking from bottom up or down, top bottom. But they have to be discussed and they have to be acted upon. However, those can face with a lot of resistance. And therefore, we try to identify in our plan a path that is doable, given the reality of how it's working in Canada. I would say we also did this because when you look at the numbers in Canada, 78% of the emissions today are not directly attributable to citizens' action. So 78% comes from industry, from heavy transport, from private sectors. So just targeting citizen is a bit missing the part. Not that we have to forget them, but if we want to transform this, the citizen has no control on how much electricity is available. Okay, the citizen does not have much control in the regulation that says how you build a building, how you price this. So those are actions that need to be taken from outside. And the same thing, forbidding trucks that consume more than 7 liters 100 kilometers. That's something that it belongs to the government, not each citizen by themselves. So those are actions that clearly need to be taken.
Okay, no more question now. Final comment, gentlemen.
Simon, you want to?
Yeah. I was going to add to before you delved into that last question. One of the slides at the beginning had the principle guiding the plan, right? Some things that we think are broad themes that must absolutely be kept in mind when designing any measure, the ones we propose or any others. And one of them, I think I want to conclude by insisting again on that one, but one of them is that even though this is very short term, we have so much trouble getting things into motion that we fear the temptation will be to move slowly. And so incrementally, I guess is the better point. The problem with incremental moves is that it may forget about the longer term target, which is net zero. And again, bring us back to one of the issues we outlined during the last hour, which is, be careful about what you build next year or this year, because after 2030, we'll still be there. And the next part is even more difficult. So what do you do with that infrastructure if it's not compatible with the longer term objective, right? So I think this should really be part of the way that the plan is designed, so that movement is really a complete change from the inertia that we've observed in the past.
And we believe it's possible. So, I mean, I saw that, no, it's not a pessimistic. I think we're trying to get a pragmatic point of view on what's happening. It is possible. And we think that the main issue today, we have to focus not on the targets and raising the target, but in really getting motion off the ground. And that's really where this federal plan should be, how to align the stars, align the efforts so that we really get moving in the right direction. It is possible to do this, but it will require very strong leadership and very strong plan that is focusing on some of the issues we raised instead of illusory or impossible goals, I would say.
Well, thank you, Simon. Thank you, Normand, for your clear answers and for that good presentation. And thank you, everyone that joined us today. Remind you that you can still ask for stronger action from your respective governments, and we would invite you to do so. And with that, I thank you all again, and wish you a happy remainder of the day. And see you soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.